It's been a wonderful morning. I've learned so much. I love coming to these things, so hopefully I can add to the conversation. So Ahmed asked me to talk specifically about my research in vaccine hesitancy, or what we call vaccine confidence. So actually, it was interesting when I was talking to him, it's sort of a pervasiveness in terms of lack of vaccine confidence. And so even though we still vaccinate, I felt like I just want to go over the facts a little bit first. So 3 of the things that we hear a lot about people being concerned, parents being concerned about vaccinating their children, is that they'd like to fight infections the natural way. They're worried about the side effects of vaccines, and then they worry about overwhelming the immune system. When I was preparing these slides, I had these up here, and some of the research shows that if you state the misinformation, even if you're saying it to dispute it, sometimes that gets stuck in people's minds. So I put some nice slides or nice images below of the March for Science to sort of counteract the negative misinformation that's there. So vaccines obviously work. Mass vaccination is one of the most successful public health interventions that we have ever had since public sanitation. As you can see, we don't see polio, we don't see smallpox and diphtheria in this country. And it's estimated that there have been 322 million cases of vaccine-preventable diseases that have been prevented from 1994 through 2013 alone, and that translates into 732,000 deaths prevented as well. So I am old enough that in my practice I have seen meningococcemia, which is the child's foot over there. It's a terrible disease. I have known people who have had polio, although I have not seen diagnosed any cases myself. But really, when we talk about the natural way, this is what nature looks like, and so obviously we don't want to go back to the natural way. In terms of side effects, the incidence of side effects is real, but it's also very small. The risk of severe allergic reaction to any vaccine is 1 in a million cases, and then nobody talks about we should do away with Tylenol. But the cases of severe reaction to Tylenol are 50,000 per 1 million, and this is an artist's depiction of what 50,000 people look like. The last thing is that the concern that vaccines will overwhelm the immune system. If that were the case, then those who got more vaccines should actually be sicker than those who did not, right? So a very simple study, somebody went and went back and looked at kids who were 2 to 3 years old, who had a hospital or ER admission, and compared those to those who did not. And if vaccines actually weaken the immune system, those who were hospitalized for non-vaccine preventable infection should actually have had more antigen exposure, more vaccines prior to that. And of course, that was not the case. So it doesn't affect the immune system's ability to fight infection. And we know that, right? Our body is constantly being confronted with different antigens. Just a dog licking your baby's face probably exposes that baby to more antigens than any single vaccine. So there is no controversy, but obviously there's a lot of noise, as we heard from Letitia's presentation. And why is that? Only 2% of kindergartners have vaccine exceptions. So those are the true vaccine refusers. They represent a small proportion of the people who actually delay or refuse some vaccines, but they have an outsized voice. And because it is on a continuum, there are people who accept all vaccines unquestioningly. There are those who accept but have doubts, and then there are those who do refuse some but accept other vaccines. And it's all coming from this small proportion of the society, which is having an outsized voice. So in multiple studies, my own and others amongst diverse racial groups, pretty much everybody says they trust their physician for vaccine advice. But as we can kind of see from some of the studies that we've heard today, what people say and how they actually react are two different things. So reality is much more complicated. We did this study, and this was amongst African American parents, and we asked them who they trusted for vaccine advice. And the brown bars are just overall who they trusted for vaccine advice. But what we did was we showed half of the group when we said, oh, do you trust a mother who accepted the vaccine for her own child, or a person who survived the disease? Half of the group we showed race concordant pictures, so other African American examples, and then the other half of the group we showed race discordant examples, so Caucasian examples. And as you can see, overall what we found was that those who were shown race concordant examples were more likely to trust that source of information than those who were shown race discordant examples. And actually, those who were shown race concordant examples of parents, mothers, disease survivors, and scientists actually were trusted more highly than those who were shown race discordant examples of the pediatrician. So this is social contagion theory, what I like to call the discover commercial theory, which is we treat you like you treat yourself. And in those commercials, they have people who look like themselves, and they have this great conversation, and you're trusting them with your money. And the subtle message there is that we're trusting somebody because they seem like ourselves. And in another one of our studies, we found that 8 in 10 parents say that they trust friends and family for vaccine advice, and that when they reported that their friends and family had low confidence and had anti-HPV vaccine views, the parents themselves were more likely to refuse HPV vaccine. So in addition to accepting the advice of people who we know, people tend to accept the advice of people who they just think are like them, even if they don't know these people. And so Cahan did this interesting study. This is based on cultural cognition theory. And he got the baseline opinions of people about requiring HPV vaccine for schools, and then created these fake archetypes of different types of people, and sort of plotted them out ahead of time in terms of where he thought that these people would be considered in terms of whether they were highly hierarchical, meaning thinking that the society has sort of a ranking for where people stand, or whether they were more egalitarian in that everybody has sort of equal rights, whether they were more communitarian in terms of whether people should support each other, or whether they were more individualistic in terms of everybody should take care of themselves. And then he presented the participants with different views, pro and con, about, or just one view for each person, about supposedly from one of these members, in terms of whether this person supported mandatory HPV vaccine in schools. And what he found was, regardless of where the participant stood when they started the experiment, they would move more toward the viewpoint of the argument based on whether they thought this person shared their same worldview. So people adopt the views of people who they think are like them, and then they adopt the views of people who they admire. And it can be subtle. So not all anti-vaxxers are like that picture I showed that was at the California State Legislature when they had mandatory vaccines. They can be celebrities. And in my surveys and other people's surveys, nobody says that they trust celebrities for vaccine advice. Because consciously, obviously, we're going to choose the doctor rather than the celebrity. But it can be subtle. And so, Jessica Biel and Katie Couric are good examples of people who come out and say they're not anti-vaccine. Jessica Biel lobbied with Robert Kennedy Jr. against the California vaccination bill, and then she said, oh, I'm not anti-vaccine, I just want parents to be able to make a choice. Well, that's facetious. We don't tell parents that they have a choice whether or not children should be buckled into into car seats and seat belts. When there's a preponderance of evidence for something, there's no reason for that choice. And Katie Couric says, she apologized afterwards, saying that the segment that she had, in which she had parents talking about unsubstantiated claims about terrible things that happened after the HPV vaccine occurred, she said, well, I had, a scientist as well. But the only people that she had on stage were the people who had these dramatic stories, and they had a lot of the airtime, and then she had a few minutes of a physician or a scientist in the audience sort of giving the rebuttal. And so that colors people's overall opinions. I have about 15 minutes per patient to actually counsel everything in a well-child check. And when people are constantly bombarded by misinformation or subtle cues, there's very little that I can do in the 2 minutes of counseling to combat what comes in society. So the last thing, or not the last thing, in terms of ways social norms sort of affect our views, is social control theory. So in addition to adopting the views of people that we think are like us, we don't necessarily even, the people giving the ideas don't even actually have to talk about vaccines in order to sort of spread this sort of, this feeling of anti-vaccine. And this I call sort of the goopy pseudoscience spread. Anti-vaccine sentiment sometimes is wrapped in this whole sense of group identity, and it's very aspirational for some people. So studies have shown that vaccine refusers tend to be white, wealthy, college-educated. They believe in, again, the natural way of doing things. They often are vegan or vegetarian and believe in organic gardening. And so this is what Gwyneth Paltrow has tapped into. She has said that her brand is very aspirational. So if you can't afford a $72 church-scented candle, there are other ways that you can feel that you're part of this group by adopting some of her other ideas about crystal healing power and, again, doing things the natural way. This group identity is also mixed in with this idea of being a perfect parent. So vaccine refusers also see themselves as experts in their own children. They may not be a scientist, but they know as much as the pediatrician about their own children. And of course, you do want to give parents voice and have that agency. But vaccine refusers tend to be intensive about mothering, do a lot of attachment parenting where, anything that their child needs, they should be responding to. So again, if you don't have the time to be going to all the PTA meetings or making your own baby food for your baby, you feel like you are in charge and can make this decision about vaccination for your own child because you know what's best for your child. And so it's a way, when you make that choice, it feels affirming to some parents, like I've made this decision for my child, I am a good parent. So I'm going to slide a little bit away from social norms and talk about some of the other things that affect people's choice. And it's the power of the personal anecdote. And so, these are Washington Redskins cheerleader and Jenny McCarthy. And in their day jobs, right, you would never say, I'm going to trust the cheerleader or the former Playboy model for their advice on vaccines. But their stories are very compelling, right? And so this Washington Redskin cheerleader, she said after she got the flu vaccine, she started to walk backwards. She couldn't speak for a while. And really, for 5 years after her story came out, a lot of my parents were concerned about the flu vaccine, and my vaccination rates went down because of her story. Jenny McCarthy, she talks about her son, and if you can see that image, right, she is associating greenness and being environmentally conscious and being organic with refusal of vaccines. And she has this story about how she protected her son, and that resonates with people a lot. And of course, he probably had Landau-Kleffner syndrome, which is associated with decreased speech fluency around age of 2, and seizures, which her son had. So why does this happen? People like to find patterns in meaningless noise. It's a way that we are able to organize our world. It explains why a 10-year-old grilled cheese sandwich sold for $28,000 on eBay, because people could see the Virgin Mary in it. It also explains why people believe that side effects or abortions, for instance, happen from vaccines. If you give 10 million women, pregnant women, any shot, the natural rate of spontaneous abortions mean that over 16,000 of them will have a spontaneous abortion. And of course, it's a very devastating thing for a woman to experience, and people look for meaning. And a lot of people will associate that, if it is coincidence, with a vaccine. And then lastly is the issue of confirmation bias. So people tend to believe things that reinforce their prior beliefs. For instance, Nyhan did this study where he gave people facts based on the CDC information. And those people who actually received corrective advice about the flu vaccine, after receiving it, actually were less likely to accept the vaccine if prior to receiving the information they were anti-vaccine. So I am running out of time. I just wanted to quickly say things that we can do to ensure vaccine confidence. Improve education in science and math. I think we all know that the US has been stagnant after being very low compared to other countries. In terms of math education, we are below Latvia and Slovenia in terms of our scores, and that's been that way for several years. The other thing that I recommend is supporting school immunization requirements. Not only does that protect people who aren't able to get the vaccine, as well as people who haven't seroconverted, it reestablishes the norm. If everybody is getting the vaccine, then it's something that we all do. As you can see in this slide, the gray states are the ones that have only medical exemptions. So most of the country allows different exemptions for vaccines that are not medically indicated. Okay. And then lastly, mobilize the community and I don't know why these are sliding in. Give voice to the majority view. Remember that anti-vaxxers are only 2% of the population. So do it through love. So send fun cards. Mom, thank you for loving, supporting, and vaccinating me. Do it through humor. Too bad there isn't a vaccine against stupidity. And do it through raising your voice. This is my family at the March for Science. Sometimes it's awkward to actually, being somebody who actually studies this, it is even awkward for me when I hear other parents saying anti-vaccine things. So do it subtly. Wear the button. Mine says flu shot, check. Or wear the t-shirt. So I have a t-shirt that says science, not silence. But the main idea here is don't be silent. Use your voice subtly or loudly, and make sure that others hear the majority view. Because vaccine saves lives.